At 3:14 on the morning of December 14th, 1939, Colonel Aleksandr Dolzhenkov sat inside a frozen command tent at Loimola, Finland, trying to write a report that made sense. 41 years old, 18 years in the Red Army, 3 campaigns. He had never written a report like this one. Outside, his regiment was gone. The 18th Rifle Division had sent 1,200 men into the forest at dusk the previous evening. By midnight, 340 had returned. The rest were somewhere in the dark, dead, wounded, frozen, some still running. Dolzhenkov had not seen a single Finnish soldier all night. His men had been shot from positions they could not locate, flanked by forces that left no footprints in the snow, ambushed at points they had already cleared. The Finnish army had materialized from the forest and disappeared back into it. No shouts, no charges, no flag. He wrote 4 words at the top of his report page. He crossed them out. He wrote them again. They are not human. 542 confirmed kills. That was one Finnish sniper, operating alone in 98 days. But Dolzhenkov did not know about Hayha yet. He only knew what was happening to his regiment. And what was happening to his regiment had no explanation that he could write in official military language. This is not the story of Finland's victory. That story is well known. This is the story of what Soviet commanders saw, felt, and wrote in the months before they understood they were fighting something they had never encountered before. The reports they sent to Moscow, the language they reached for when standard military terminology failed, as the psychological collapse of an army that arrived with everything and walked into a forest that destroyed them one soldier at a time. This is the story of a colonel who tried to put into words what no military document was designed to describe. Aleksandr Dolzhenkov was born in 1898 in Voronezh, a city in central Russia 500 kilometers south of Moscow. His father was a railway worker. The family had nothing. Dolzhenkov joined the Red Army in 1921 at age 23, drawn not by ideology, but by the promise of a uniform, food, and structure. He was competent. He rose steadily. By 1935, he commanded a rifle regiment in the Leningrad military district. By 1939, his regiment was positioned near the Finnish border. He knew Finland was next. Everyone in the Leningrad military district knew. The political directives had been arriving for weeks. Finland was a hostile bourgeois state. Finland harbored anti-Soviet elements. Finland posed a strategic threat to Leningrad, which sat only 32 kilometers from the Finnish border. Something would happen. On November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union attacked Finland along a 1,300-kilometer front. The invasion force numbered approximately 450,000 soldiers in the initial wave, 1,500 tanks, 3,000 aircraft. The People's Commissariat of Defense predicted Finnish resistance would collapse in 9 to 12 days. Finland's entire standing army at the outbreak of war numbered 300,000 soldiers. Of those, 250,000 were reservists called up in the preceding weeks. Many arrived without proper winter clothing. Their air force had 114 aircraft. Their tank force consisted of 32 obsolete vehicles. They had no anti-tank guns in meaningful numbers. The Red Army outnumbered Finnish forces in tanks by a ratio of nearly 100 to 1. Dolzhenkov's regiment crossed the border on December 1st. The first day was almost peaceful. Snow-covered roads, pine forest on both sides, no Finnish soldiers visible anywhere. His scouts moved ahead, found nothing. The regiment advanced 14 kilometers without contact. He wrote in his diary that evening, "The enemy has withdrawn. The population has fled. We are moving through an empty country." He was wrong. The country was not empty. It was watching. The Finnish defensive doctrine was not designed by a general sitting behind a map table. It was designed by the landscape itself. Finland, in December 1939, was a country of forests so dense that visibility between trees measured in meters, not kilometers. Lakes and rivers frozen solid enough to walk on, but also frozen into obstacles that channeled movement. Forced roads created natural kill zones. Temperatures that fell to minus 40 degrees Celsius in the interior. A darkness that lasted 18 hours per day north of Helsinki. Finnish soldiers had grown up in this landscape. Many of them had been hunting in these forests since childhood. They knew that a man moving through snow makes a specific sound. They knew that breath vapor in minus 30-degree cold rises in a visible column that can be seen 200 meters away. They knew that a Soviet truck column moving down a forest road at night lit its headlights because Soviet drivers could not navigate without them. They knew that a Soviet soldier in a greatcoat was dressed for Russian winter, not Finnish winter. Different thing. And the Finnish army had developed a tactical philosophy in the years before the war that translated these natural advantages into doctrine. It was called motti, the Finnish word for a cubic meter of firewood. The tactic was simple. Allow the Soviet columns to advance along the roads. Let them penetrate deep into Finnish territory. Then cut the column into isolated sections. Surround each section. Prevent resupply. Wait. A column cut into sections cannot advance. It cannot retreat. It cannot be resupplied by road because Finnish soldiers controlled the forest on both sides. It can only sit in place and die. The forest did the rest. Dolzhenkov's regiment encountered its first motti on December 6th, and his lead battalion had advanced along a logging road northeast of Lomola when Finnish forces felled trees across the road simultaneously at 3 points, front and rear. The battalion was 800 meters long. The tree barrier sealed both ends in under 4 minutes. When Soviet soldiers tried to push through the forest to clear the barriers, Finnish riflemen who had been lying motionless in the snow for 6 hours opened fire from positions 50 meters off the road. The battalion commander radioed Dolzhenkov. The colonel ordered a breakout to the east, away from the road, into the forest. The breakout force of 200 soldiers entered the trees. Finnish soldiers withdrew before them, invisible, firing from positions that never appeared to be occupied twice. The breakout force moved 400 meters into the forest. Then it stopped, and it could not find the enemy. It could not return to the road. It could not advance. Dolzhenkov's report to division headquarters that evening described the situation in precise military language. He listed positions. He estimated enemy strength. He noted casualties. What he did not include in the official report was what he wrote in his personal diary. The men are afraid of the forest, not of the Finnish soldiers, of the forest itself. They do not understand why they are dying. They hear shots and men fall, but they see nothing. They fire into the trees and nothing happens. The forest absorbs everything we send into it and gives nothing back. He was describing something that Soviet commanders across the entire front were experiencing simultaneously, though none of them knew it yet. In the reports flowing back to Leningrad military district headquarters and from there to Moscow described a tactical reality that Soviet military doctrine had no framework for processing. The Red Army in 1939 was built for a different war. It had been trained to fight on open ground. Its doctrine centered on mass, on armor, on air superiority, on artillery preparation followed by infantry assault. These doctrines worked on the plains of Ukraine. They worked against forces that could be seen, fixed, and destroyed. They did not work against an enemy that operated in dense forest, that never presented a fixed line, that attacked by melting into terrain and firing from invisibility. The Soviet soldier in the forests of Finland was not just outfought, He was out-adapted, and he arrived wearing a greatcoat designed for Russian temperatures of minus 15 degrees. Finnish temperatures in December 1939 reached minus 40 in the interior. His boots were leather. His rations required cooking over open fires. His tank was designed for open steppe operations and became helpless the moment it left the road in Finnish forest. His artillery needed clear lines of sight. There were none. His aircraft needed identifiable targets. The Finns were under the trees, and the Finns wore white. This detail appears in more Soviet after-action reports from the Winter War than almost any other. Soviet soldiers wrote about it. Soviet officers reported it. Soviet commanders referenced it in dispatches that have since been declassified and studied by military historians. But the Finnish soldiers were invisible not because of magic, but because they wore white smocks over their uniforms and lay down in snow. The Red Army soldiers wore brown or khaki. In the forest, in December, in Finland, the difference between brown and white was the difference between visible and invisible. Dolzhenkov requisitioned white camouflage for his regiment on December 9th. The request was processed through Leningrad Military District Supply. It was denied. White fabric was not a standard issue item. The procurement system had no category for it. His men continued to die in brown. On December 12th, the 18th Rifle Division ordered Dolzhenkov's regiment to execute a flanking movement around the main Finnish defensive line south of Loimola. The route ran through 8 kilometers of dense forest with no roads. The regiment would move in column at night, guided by compass bearings. Dolzhenkov protested. He had 14 days of operational experience in Finnish forest. He knew what happened to Soviet columns moving through Finnish forest at night. His division commander overruled him. The timetable from Leningrad demanded the operation proceed. The regiment moved out at 1700 hours on December 13th. 1,200 men, full combat load, 40 supply sleds pulled by horses. The forest closed around them immediately. The first shot came at 1847, a single round from the dark, from somewhere to the left, and a sergeant at the head of the column dropped without a sound. The column halted. Officers ordered men to return fire to the left. They fired for 4 minutes at positions they could not see. Then the forest was silent again. The column advanced. Then another shot at 1912. Another man down. Another halt. Another 4 minutes of blind fire into darkness. The horses were trembling. Men at the rear of the column could not see the front. They had no idea what was happening ahead. They stood in the dark and waited. This was Finnish harassing fire, not designed to destroy the column, designed to stop it, to exhaust it, to make it stand in the cold. A standing column of men in minus 30-degree temperatures loses combat effectiveness within 2 hours. The men at the front are afraid to advance. The men at the rear cannot see enough to react. Officers cannot communicate down the length of the column. The horses will not move. The sleds jackknife on uneven ground. Everything freezes. At 21:30, the column had advanced 2.3 kilometers in 4.5 hours. Dolzhenkov halted the regiment and ordered defensive positions in the forest. Men began digging in the frozen ground with entrenching tools. The ground was frozen solid to a depth of 40 centimeters. They could not dig. They built fires instead. The fires were visible from 2 kilometers in every direction in the dark forest. Finnish observers noted the positions. Radio operators reported the coordinates. Finnish mortar teams set up 3 kilometers away and began firing at 22:15. By midnight, Dolzhenkov's regiment had taken 290 casualties. He had not located a single Finnish position. He had not fired a single round that he knew had hit anything. His supply sleds were scattered across 600 meters of broken forest trail. 4 horses were dead. 17 men had frostbite severe enough to require evacuation, and he ordered a withdrawal at 1 o'clock on December 14th. The withdrawal was worse than the advance. Men who had been lying in minus 30-degree cold for 3 hours could not move quickly. Finnish soldiers followed the withdrawal, firing from both flanks, targeting officers whose shoulder boards caught the light from Soviet muzzle flashes. By the time the regiment reached the starting point of the previous evening's operation, 340 men had returned. That was when Dolzhenkov sat down in the frozen tent and tried to write his report. He was not alone in his confusion. Across the entire Finnish front in December 1939, Soviet commanders were sending dispatches to Moscow that historians would later describe as a documentary record of institutional psychological shock. General Kirill Meretskov, commanding the Leningrad military district, received reports from his subordinate commanders throughout December that used language unprecedented in Soviet military communications. One divisional commander wrote that his men believed Finnish soldiers could become invisible at will. Another reported that Finnish soldiers appeared to be able to operate for days without food or sleep. A regimental commander reported that Finnish soldiers fired accurately in complete darkness at targets they could not possibly see. None of these things were supernatural. All of them were explicable. Finnish soldiers could operate in darkness because they had trained in darkness. Finnish soldiers could endure cold that Soviet soldiers could not because they wore the correct clothing and their bodies had adapted to Finnish winters through years of living in them. And Finnish soldiers could fire accurately in darkness because they were firing at Soviet soldiers who had lit fires, who were standing in the open, who were making sounds, whose position was obvious. The Soviets were not fighting ghosts. They were fighting men who understood the environment they were fighting in. The difference between those two things was lethal. The reports that reached Moscow described tactical failures in military language, but between the precise terminology, the language of men who could not explain what was happening to them appeared. One regimental report described Finnish soldiers who melted back into the snow after an ambush, and another described an attack that came from all directions simultaneously, from forces that could not have been positioned in those locations. A divisional after-action report used the phrase, "The forest itself was hostile," to describe conditions on the Karelian Isthmus. These were professional military officers. They were not prone to mysticism. They were writing within a system that punished reports that admitted confusion or failure. The fact that language like this appeared in official Soviet military communications is a measure of how completely Finnish tactics had shattered the cognitive framework that Soviet officers brought to Finland. Dolzhenkov's regiment was reassigned on December 18th. His regimental strength stood at 680 effectives, down from 1,200 at the start of the month. He was ordered to hold a defensive line east of Lomola, while higher command reconsidered operational plans. The reconsidering of plans was happening at every level of the Soviet command structure simultaneously. By mid-December 1939, it was clear to Meretskov and to Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, who would replace him in command in January, that the initial Soviet operational concept had failed entirely. The assumptions on which the invasion had been planned, quick Finnish collapse, easy movement through Finnish terrain, decisive armored action, had all proven catastrophically wrong. The forests of Finland were not the plains of Ukraine. The Finnish army was not the Polish army. And the motti tactics being employed by Finnish commanders were not something that Soviet military doctrine had a prepared response to. At the strategic level, the Soviet Union had deployed overwhelming force against a small nation and had been unable to make that force decisive. The question being debated in Moscow in December 1939 was not whether Finland was a tough opponent. The question was why the Red Army, the largest military force on Earth, could not process that toughness into victory. Part of the answer was command. Soviet military culture in 1939 operated under a terror that was specific to the Stalin era. The Great Purge of 1937 and 1938 had executed or imprisoned approximately 35,000 Red Army officers, including 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and 50 of 57 corps commanders. The officers who remained were those who had not been denounced. Many of them had survived by not standing out, by not challenging orders, by reporting what their superiors wanted to hear rather than what was actually happening. This culture produced a specific failure mode in Finland. Officers who understood that the current tactics were not working were reluctant to say so clearly, because saying so clearly invited accusations of defeatism, which in Stalin's Soviet Union was a path to the firing squad. So they wrote reports that used careful language, that attributed failures to enemy trickery rather than doctrinal inadequacy, that requested more men and more equipment, rather than questioning whether the fundamental approach was wrong. Dolzhenkov was aware of this dynamic. His diary, which survived the war and was examined by Finnish historians after its capture, shows a man navigating between what he saw and what he could report. That his official reports described enemy strength as greater than anticipated. His diary described an enemy that was simply better adapted to the terrain. He did not write this in his reports. The psychological impact on Soviet soldiers was severe and documented. Reports from commissars assigned to rifle units during December 1939 described morale deterioration at a speed that surprised even Soviet political officers, who were trained to expect morale problems and manage them. The core of the problem was the invisibility. Soviet soldiers understood how to fight an enemy they could see. They had been trained to charge, to fire, to advance against a visible opponent. Finnish tactics denied them a visible opponent entirely. Soviet soldiers were dying from shots that came from directions they could not identify, fired by men they never saw, from positions they could not locate. A political commissar's report from December 14th, recovered from a Soviet position overrun by Finnish forces near Sumusalmi, described the situation in terms that went beyond standard political language. The commissar wrote that soldiers were questioning the purpose of advancing, when advancing meant walking toward invisible fire. He wrote that men were sleeping in turns in groups for warmth, wrapped around each other on the ground, too cold to post proper sentries. He wrote that several soldiers had discharged their weapons without orders during the night, firing into the dark forest at sounds they could not identify. He did not describe these men as cowards. He described them as confused. There is a difference. At Sumusalmi, the scale of Soviet confusion reached its most documented extreme. That the Soviet 44th and 163rd Divisions had advanced into Sumusalmi in early December with the mission of cutting Finland in half at its narrowest point. The route ran through approximately 80 kilometers of wilderness, a single road through unbroken forest and frozen lakes, with nothing on either side except trees, snow, and temperature. Finnish Colonel Hjalmar Silasvuo had 11,000 men to stop them. The Soviets had 45,000. Silasvuo divided his force and applied the motti principle at scale. He cut the Soviet column at multiple points simultaneously, created isolated pockets, and then systematically destroyed each pocket in sequence. The 44th Division attempted to relieve the 163rd. Finnish forces cut the 44th Division into its own separate encirclements. By early January 1940, approximately 27,500 Soviet soldiers were surrounded in pockets in the Sumusalmi wilderness. They were 80 kilometers from the nearest Soviet supply base. The temperature was minus 40 degrees Celsius. They had food for 4 days. Soviet soldiers in the encirclements sent radio messages to headquarters that were monitored and later studied. The messages described conditions that had no precedent in Soviet military experience. Soldiers were cutting flesh from dead horses for food. Men with frostbite were being left behind as the mobile units attempted breakouts that failed. Officers had lost control of portions of their commands because units had fragmented in the forest. Men were surrendering to Finnish soldiers who had no facilities to take prisoners. The Finns could not process 27,500 prisoners. They had no camps, no transport, and no food for them. Finnish soldiers occasionally found Soviet soldiers who had simply stopped moving, who had sat down in the snow and frozen. Not killed in action, not wounded, just stopped. Finnish frontline reports described Soviet soldiers who appeared to have given up not from defeat in battle, but from an inability to understand what was happening to them. One Finnish officer's account described capturing a Soviet platoon of 24 men who had been sitting in the forest for 3 days without moving. Their lieutenant was frozen. The men were gathered around his body. They had food. They had ammunition. They had simply stopped. Dolzhenkov was not at Sumusalmi. He was 200 kilometers south, holding his reduced regiment on the Loimola line. But the news from Sumusalmi reached Soviet units across the front through a combination of official communications and the informal networks that exist in any army. By mid-January, Soviet soldiers in his regiment knew that something catastrophic had happened in the north. The effect on morale was measurable. Commissar reports from Dolzhenkov's regiment in January describe an increase in self-inflicted wounds. Not dramatic numbers. 3 confirmed cases in January. But 3 confirmed cases meant the real number was higher, because self-inflicted wounds required both a wound and a witness who would report it. In an army where the penalty for cowardice was death, the number willing to wound themselves and then report it represented only the most desperate. Dolzhenkov wrote in his diary on January 8th, "The men understand now that Finland is not what they told us it was. They do not say this openly, but they know, and knowing changes what they will do when ordered to advance." What he was describing was an army's relationship with its own courage. Courage in military operations is not an absence of fear. It is the ability to act despite fear, sustained by belief that the action has a purpose and a chance of success. Finnish tactics had systematically undermined both. Soviet soldiers advancing through Finnish forest had no clear purpose because they could not identify an enemy to defeat. They had no visible chance of success because the forest offered no visible enemies to kill. They were advancing into darkness and dying from nothing they could see. This was the psychological genius of the motti system, and it was not designed as a psychological weapon. It was designed as a tactical response to impossible odds. Finland could not defeat the Soviet Union in a conventional engagement. Finland had no choice but to fight in a way that negated Soviet mass. The psychological destruction of Soviet units was a consequence of tactics designed for survival, not a deliberate terror weapon. But the effect was the same. Moscow's response to the failures of December and January was not to question the strategic premise of the war. It was to replace commanders and apply more force. General Meretskov was relieved on January 7th and replaced by Marshal Timoshenko. Timoshenko was a different kind of commander. He understood that the failures in Finland were doctrinal and institutional, not simply a matter of insufficient force. Timoshenko's first actions were administrative. He ordered a halt to offensive operations on most of the front while he reorganized. He established proper supply lines. He ordered white camouflage smocks for all infantry units. The request that Dolzhenkov had submitted and been denied in December. He reorganized the command structure to reduce the layers of political interference that slowed decision-making. He required honest after-action reports. This last requirement was the most radical. Timoshenko wanted to know what had actually happened, not what commanders wished had happened, not what Moscow wanted to hear, what happened. The honest reports that came back to Timoshenko in January 1940 painted a picture that would not be officially acknowledged by the Soviet Union for decades. They described unit collapses, unauthorized withdrawals, soldiers found frozen in positions they had abandoned without orders. They described artillery units that had fired their shells without effect because the forest absorbed the fragments. They described tank crews who had frozen to death inside their vehicles because they could not exit into fire and could not survive without heating. Dolzhenkov's report to Timoshenko's reorganized command, submitted on January 19, 1940, is one of the most detailed accounts of Finnish tactical effectiveness to survive from the Winter War. It ran to 11 pages. It described his regiment's operations from December 1st through January 15th in precise language, with accurate casualty figures and honest assessments of enemy effectiveness. And one section of the report dealt specifically with the psychological impact of Finnish tactics on his soldiers. Dolzhenkov wrote, "The enemy conducts operations with extreme economy. He does not assault. He does not charge. He fires from positions of complete concealment and then withdraws before we can locate him." The result is that our soldiers have fired thousands of rounds of ammunition at an enemy they have not once seen clearly. This has a specific effect on the soldier's relationship with his rifle. He no longer trusts that his rifle can protect him because he has never seen it protect him. He fires into darkness and receives fire from darkness. And the psychological effect of this is more damaging than the physical casualties. This passage was unusual enough in the context of Soviet military communications of the era that historians who later studied it noted it as evidence of an officer who had thought carefully about what he had seen, rather than simply categorizing it. Dolzhenkov was describing something that military psychologists in later decades would come to understand as the specific trauma of fighting an invisible enemy. It was different from the fear of artillery, which was random. It was different from the fear of air attack, which came from above. It was the fear of being hunted by something that could see you, but that you could not see. The Finnish soldiers were not supernatural. Dolzhenkov understood this intellectually, but in his diary, as distinct from his official report, he described the experience from the inside of the Soviet lines in language that revealed how difficult that intellectual understanding was to hold onto under operational conditions. "I know they are men. I know they are cold and hungry and afraid as we are. But my men do not know this. My men have not seen them. In the absence of seeing, the mind fills in what is there with what it fears." Timoshenko's reorganization took 6 weeks. By February 1st, 1940, he had assembled approximately 750,000 Soviet soldiers along the Karelian Isthmus for a renewed offensive against the Mannerheim Line, the main Finnish defensive fortification system. The force included 6,000 artillery pieces. The new approach was not built on Finnish tactics, but it was built on the one thing the Soviet Union had that Finland categorically could not match: industrial firepower at scale. Timoshenko's artillery preparation began on February 1st and continued for 11 days. 6,000 guns fired at known Finnish fortification positions. The bombardment was not subtle. It was not designed to be. It was designed to destroy every Finnish defensive structure that had been identified and to destroy the psychological capacity of the Finnish soldiers holding them. This the Soviet army knew how to do. On open ground, against fixed fortifications, with unlimited ammunition and thousands of guns, the Red Army was devastating. The Finnish soldiers in the Mannerheim Line bunkers endured 11 days of bombardment that has been described by survivors as unlike anything humanly survivable. Our concrete, reinforced positions collapsed. Underground shelters filled with concussion. Men went deaf. Men lost the ability to speak. Dolzhenkov's regiment was not part of the Karelian Isthmus offensive. He remained on the Loimola line, in the same frozen forest where he had spent the winter. His regiment's war continued in the pattern that had been established in December. Harassing fire from invisible positions, occasional Finnish raids that materialized from the forest and disappeared back into it, cold, darkness, the specific psychological exhaustion of fighting an enemy you cannot see. On February 17, 1940, the same morning that Simo Hayha lay in his snowdrift near Kola and shot 12 Soviet soldiers in 4 minutes, Dolzhenkov wrote in his diary. The date is notable only in retrospect. He did not know about Hayha. He wrote about a specific incident the previous night, when a Finnish sniper had killed 2 of his officers in rapid succession from a position that was never identified. We found no footprints afterward. The ground was hard, and the sniper had been lying on the snow surface, not standing in it. He left no mark we could find. He was there, and then he was not. My men do not talk about this incident. They know not to talk about it. But I see how they move when they cross open ground. They move differently than they did in November. They have learned something from this country that cannot be unlearned. What his men had learned was the specific knowledge that they were prey, not soldiers in a contest between armies, prey in a forest, hunted by men who knew the forest and whom the forest concealed. This knowledge, once acquired, is not discarded when the tactical situation changes. It remains. The Mannerheim Line broke on February 12, 1940, 11 days into the Soviet bombardment. Finnish forces on the isthmus withdrew in stages, fighting for every kilometer but unable to hold fixed positions under 6,000 guns. The Finnish government, which had been aware throughout the war that Finland could delay but not ultimately defeat a fully committed Soviet Union, opened ceasefire negotiations in early March. The Moscow Peace Treaty was signed on March 12, 1940. Finland ceded approximately 11% of its territory, including the city of Viipuri and the Karelian Isthmus. The Soviet Union received the territorial concessions it had originally demanded in October 1939. Finland retained its independence. The war had lasted 105 days, and Soviet casualties in the Winter War were not officially acknowledged by the Soviet Union during the war or for decades afterward. Post-Soviet access to military archives has allowed historians to develop estimates with reasonable confidence. The scholarly consensus is approximately 126,000 Soviet soldiers killed in action, approximately 320,000 wounded, approximately 5,600 tanks destroyed or abandoned, approximately 900 aircraft lost. Finland lost approximately 25,000 soldiers killed in action, 43,000 wounded. This, in a nation of 3.7 million people, was catastrophic in human terms. Every family in Finland was affected by the Winter War, but Finland survived. Dolzhenkov survived the Winter War and returned to the Soviet Union in March 1940. He was not punished, which was not guaranteed, and he received a routine reassignment to a command in the Kyiv military district. His record noted combat experience in Finland without elaboration. His diary was not with him when his regiment was overrun by Finnish forces during a skirmish near Loimola in February 1940. It had been left in a command post. Finnish soldiers recovered it. It was archived by Finnish military intelligence and remained in Finnish archives until the 1990s, when it was studied by historians examining the Soviet experience of the Winter War. He did not know his diary had survived. He had assumed it was destroyed or lost in the chaos of the withdrawal. The diary covers 78 days of the Winter War from December 1st, 1939 to February 17th, 1940. It contains 23,000 words in Dolzhenkov's hand. You military historians who have studied it describe it as one of the most complete accounts of the Winter War from the Soviet operational level that exists. Not because Dolzhenkov was exceptional as an officer, but because he wrote honestly in a period when honesty in Soviet military communications was dangerous. What he wrote in that diary is not a record of military analysis. It is a record of a man trying to understand something that his education, his training, and his military experience had not prepared him to understand. He was a product of a military system built for a different kind of war. He arrived in Finland expecting to conduct that war. Finland refused to be the country where that war was fought. The phrase he wrote on December 14th, those 4 words at the top of the report page that he crossed out and wrote again, did not appear in any of his official reports. It appeared only in his diary. They are not human. He did not mean it as a statement of racial contempt. He was not dehumanizing Finnish soldiers. He was describing, in the only language available to him at that moment, the experience of fighting men who seemed to exist in a different relationship with the environment than the men he commanded. Men who were cold and did not freeze. Men who were invisible and deadly. Men who left no footprints and made no sound and were never where you expected them to be. He knew they were human. He wrote that too, several weeks later, when he had more distance from the worst of December. He wrote, "They bleed. We have found their dead. They are cold like us. They are afraid like us. But they are also something we are not, which is at home." At home. And that was the difference. The Finnish soldier in December 1939 was at home in a landscape that destroyed the Soviet soldier. Not because of courage or ideology or supernatural ability, because of adaptation, preparation, and the specific kind of knowledge that comes from growing up in a place and learning every one of its moods. The lessons of the Winter War were studied carefully by military observers from Germany, Great Britain, and the United States. German officers in particular drew specific conclusions from the Soviet performance in Finland. They noted the command paralysis created by the purge of experienced officers. They noted the doctrinal rigidity that prevented adaptation. They noted the supply failures and the equipment failures and the morale failures. What they did not fully note, or chose not to fully note, was the other conclusion that a smaller force correctly adapted to its environment, employing tactics suited to that environment, could impose devastating costs on a vastly larger force. This lesson also existed in the Winter War. Germany did not apply it 18 months later when it entered the forests of Russia. The Finnish soldiers who fought the Winter War are old men now, or they are gone. The youngest conscripts of November 1939 were born around 1920. They are 100 years old or more. Most are dead. Their country survived. Simo Hayha died on April 1st, 2002. He was 96 years old. He had outlived the Soviet Union. Dolzhenkov's fate after 1940 is not documented in records currently accessible to researchers. He was alive in March 1940 when the war ended. What happened to him in the German invasion of June 1941, as in the catastrophic early months of the Eastern Front, is unknown. His name does not appear in the Soviet casualty records that have been digitized. It does not appear in post-war officer registries. He may have died in 1941. He may have survived and been swallowed by the anonymity that millions of Soviet citizens vanished into. His diary survived him. It sits in Helsinki. It is 78 days of a man in a frozen forest, trying to write what he saw, crossing out the words that told the truth, and writing them again. They are not human. He was wrong. They were exactly human. They were human beings who understood where they were. And that was enough. If this story hit you, like and subscribe. We find these forgotten stories every single day. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And watch this next video. And you're not going to believe what these men did.